I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. We've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years talking about stress, talking about burnout, and talking about resiliency. And I thought we'd go right to the source and talk to an expert that I've been following on social media and been connected to her work for quite some time, Dr. Jenny Liu. And so I've invited her to come on the podcast today to talk about resiliency. And I think this is going to be an insightful conversation, regardless of where you feel on that spectrum of resiliency right now. Sometimes when I work with people, they can identify really easily the things that are going on in their lives that are helping prop them up or helping them feel like they can ebb and flow with life's ups and downs. But sometimes when I'm working with patients, they really feel like they're struggling and aren't feeling that resilient to the challenges that they face day to day. I want to invite you to listen to this conversation regardless of where you feel, because as Jenny's going to share with us, and her tagline is resiliency is not a final destination. Jenny, thanks so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Dr. Robertson.
I would love if you can share sort of how you got to this place in your work. You're quite an established researcher. You hold some incredible positions that I hope you're proud of. I would love to hear kind of how you got here to be studying resiliency with as it sits in like medicine, which I think is partly one of the reasons I'm so attracted to your work, is that it isn't sort of the fluffy self-care conversation. It's literally talking about it from that medical perspective. Can you walk us through how you got here in your career and what your role is currently?
Absolutely. So I got here, I've been a stress researcher all in graduate school, and I did my master's, my PhD in stress. And so most people think, oh, okay, it's probably pretty commonsensical. You just kind of study the reverse and resiliency. But it's actually through real life experience that I kind of stumbled in this area. So most people who's gone through grad school or medicine or medical school will tell you it's a rough period, right? You go through a lot of ups and downs. And one particular period, I experienced some cyber stalking. Yes, and some harassment, and it was really weighing down on me. I felt kind of ashamed. When you're the victim of anything, oftentimes you kind of, the first instinct is you turn inward on yourself, right? And you think, did I do something to antagonize this, to trigger this? What happened? And so it was really a hard period for me. And only then the person who was stalking me had started to actually reach out to other colleagues in my department to try and trace where I was. So at the time, people around me were starting to be alarmed for me. And at this point, they reached out to supports on my behalf, specifically my supervisor, head of the department, to really sound the alarm and say, hey, this is going on with Jenny, and we think she's not okay. We need to protect her, and we need to figure something out. It was scary, but I got through it with their help. And they really just swooped in, isolated me from the incident, ensured that there was restraining order all around, banned this certain person from campuses that I was attending. So at the time it was Toronto, it was Mississauga, and really put in place a lot of safety measures. And on top of that, because of the measures taken place, they also launched an investigation on the campus that originally this was happening out of. And as a result of that investigation, they uncovered that this person was also doing the same thing to a bunch of other students, but not just me at the graduate level, undergrads. younger girls who were, didn't have a voice and didn't know what to say. And so that experience really turned me onto this idea of resiliency. Because before that, I thought you're either a resilient person or you're not, right? And, I thought I handle things pretty well. Like it is what it is. So I consider myself pretty resilient, quote unquote. But after that incident, it made me realize it's so much more than that. It's about, what supports have I had around me, right? How was I able to assess the situation, use those resources? And really, it was a whole process as opposed to an outcome. And that's when I thought, let me look into this a little bit deeper. Let me try to read upon this. What are the characteristics or the qualities that make someone resilient or not? And that's when I uncovered that the literature, there wasn't as much dedicated to understanding the process of resilience as there were literature describing people who were considered resilient. And that kind of launched the whole history of me going down this path, trying to better understand, what makes someone quote unquote resilient and what does that actually look like, right? Are we isolating qualities about a person, or are we taking steps to better understand how they got there and better understanding or delineating the specific processes that we need to be resilient at any given time?
That's such an amazing story, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. And it's interesting for you to be able to reflect, on other people that would have been in that same situation and maybe didn't have those same resources, right? And I think that's going to be a big word that we talk about through our time together today, and how that would have impacted their ability to manage the situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that I'm sure we're going to come back to over and over again throughout the course of this podcast, is to talk about those situational factors that determine resiliency. I see people all the time that, talk to me about resiliency, and they're like, I'm a resilient person. I was able to handle this and this well. So why am I not able to do this? Or right. And it's this kind of inward turning on themselves because they got through one situation successfully, they expect it for another. And when it didn't pan out, they become kind of questioning of who they are as a person. And that in and of itself invites so much self-blame, right? We think the onus is always on ourselves because there's something inside of us that makes us resilient or not. But the reality is our resiliency is made up of so many different factors. It's made up of, our health and our health related behaviors. Is related to kind of the skills and the values that guide us through life. And it's also made up of the larger kind of structural resources that we're able to access, right? If we're going through a rough divorce and someone is kind of threatening to take our home, it's all these kind of legal threats, all these social threats, and we're not able to access a good lawyer, we're not able to access someone that's going to help us take care of our kids so we can review the legal documents, it's not going to be a good outcome. But again, that's kind of the push and pull of resources versus needs.
I'm so glad that we're going to chat this through, because even in the medical literature, and I think this is what your experience has been, and that's what kind of led you to do this work, is that you're right. Like, we just often observe resilient people doing better, right?
Yeah.
Like the conversation, whether we're talking about menopausal hot flashes or people navigating chronic pain or whatever the actual condition is, quite often the study's conclusion is like, yeah, it turns out if you're more resilient, you're going to do better. Full stop. Not really a conversation around what that means, how people get there? Like, is there can you grow in resiliency to become the person who can, do better? It's a huge gap, because it's like, this independent protective factor with respect to health and wellness is resiliency. And yet we haven't done this deep dive on, like, is this something you're just like born with, or is this something you can foster? And then when we don't have the language around fostering things in medicine, it does either leave the patient feeling a lot of shame about where they're at, but it also is not particularly empowering
Yes.
if people feel like they can't actually change that piece about them, about their situation or about themselves.
Yes, yes. And actually one example is, so went to a chronic pain conference actually earlier this year. And so a perfect example, as you were kind of speaking, and then it just jumped into my mind, was we work with a lot of veterans in our daily work. I'm part of the MacDonald Franklin OSI Research Center. I'm a research associate there, and most of our work is to support veteran well-being at the moment, as well as healthcare workers. And one veteran recounted that he had been struggling with chronic pain along with a bunch of comorbidities as a result of his service. And he could not find, service providers that was able to address his chronic pain effectively because of the way that the medical system is so siloed, right? You would get occupational therapy from one branch, you would get maybe some personalized psychotherapy in another, you get prescribed some medication for your chronic pain, perhaps for your blood pressure, what have you, right? A combination. And the challenge is, because it was so siloed, none of the providers were speaking to each other. And so he tried to take it upon himself to figure out, why is it that none of the medications and the treatments he was prescribed was working? And so he thought of himself as this resilient person. So he really kind of championed for his care, round up the healthcare providers. And in the end, it was a happy story in that he was able to figure out what was the trigger. It turns out, some of the prescribed medications were countering each other, and that's why he wasn't able to gain the benefits. But the caveat of this story is that he was under this branch of care providers that enabled at least partially access across the board for different healthcare providers. That's kind of the system level access to resources, right? Through Veteran Affairs Canada, he was able to access the support and the services he needed and rely on a team of healthcare providers to address different aspects that needed care. If you're an average Joe or an average Jane, you lack access to certain supports, for example, right? Or you're less knowledgeable or less able to dedicate time. Say you've still got a full-time job, you have to take care of your family. You can't pull out the time to champion for your own care or to navigate this complex system. What do? And we typically just judge the end picture as, say, oh, this person got through okay, they're resilient, this person, better luck next time, right? But there's so much more to that.
Yeah. And that's so important to point out, because again, we do always come down to, I was thinking of that example where we're like, we teach kindergartners to turn the lights off when they leave their bedroom to save power, rather than us like going upstream and talking to some of the like massive corporations that waste so much power, right? Like, it's like we place the responsibility down on the like small individual person without recognizing that like there are so many bigger systems at play that impact that scenario. But can we just back up for 1 second though, Jenny? Like, I'd love if you could describe what do we mean by resiliency? I'd love to hear your definition of it, because I have a working definition that I will describe to patients to try and help them understand what we mean by resiliency building when we're talking about various tasks or what have you that we want to work on it. But I don't think that the average person actually quite understands what the word resiliency means.
Absolutely. And I wonder if it's first helpful for me to identify what resiliency definitely is not. So before we get to the definition, I want to point out what resiliency is not. And it's not a quality within us. It's not just a quality within a particular person that makes them strong or makes them gritty or makes them successful or not. Instead, I think of resilience and I define resilience as this evolving capacity for an individual to deal with the challenges that come up in their lives. And I emphasize that it's an evolving capacity, because at any given time, based on what we have going on in our lives, right? that capacity can shift. It can grow bigger or it can deplete. We think of it like a fuel tank, right? Sometimes you may be surrounded by support, surrounded by resources, surrounded by all the things you need to accomplish anything you want. And at next moment's time, you might turn around and there's nothing there and your tank is empty. And so that capacity will shift over time.
I like that. And that's not that dissimilar to the way I describe it to patients. I kind of will say, it's your brain trying to do the math sort of moment to moment on whether or not you have the resources to navigate the day or the pressure or the circumstance.
Exactly.
And part of why I describe it that way is I think that sometimes we've almost graded things as whether or not they're stressful or not stressful. Right. So people will say, I don't know why, but it's so ridiculous. I feel so stressed, trying to find a parking spot at Costco. And that's so ridiculous because there are other people who are giving speeches to thousands of people and they get up on stage and they're totally fine. As if it's the task, right? As if it's the thing that determined, like that we've graded, like these things are stressful, these things aren't stressful. And so if you feel stressed doing these things that we've decided are not stressful, like you're bad, right? Like you're not being successful.
Yeah.
Essentially. When it actually doesn't matter what we're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, and so much of that changes from situation to situation too, right? You can be, standing in front of thousands giving a speech and it's totally fine. But the next week you could be at the Costco parking lot, on the verge of a panic attack. Because as we know, stress is cumulative, right? Our situations change all the time. How we feel changes all the time. And so, if we have this stable expectation that this is how we must be all the time, that's simply unrealistic. And not only that, but it's so challenging because how can we ever meet that expectation of ourselves, right? It's like we're setting ourselves up for failure.
I like that. And I we talk about this often in women's health, just because, women, like people that are cycling don't feel the same way every day, right? And there is this, almost an internal stressor that's happening post-ovulation that makes people a little bit less resilient in the second half of their menstrual cycle.
Absolutely.
And yet people kind of expect themselves to show up as this gritty, I liked your term, gritty follicular phase, can rely on less sleep, less love, less food, right? Version of themselves all the time. And then when they have some of those hormonal shifts, a little bit of a different week, different circumstance, like you mentioned there, that we feel super well supported at work, but maybe not that well supported at home. And our capacity for those stressors, even if they on paper are a little bit minute, right, has shifted. But it's that expectation of expecting yourself to be the same way and feel the same way all the time that I think it creates that blame cycle in people.
Yeah, and women especially, because we are kind of socially brought up to take on so many roles at the same time, right? We're the care provider. At home, we have to take care of our home, but then at work, we also want to strive because, right, we want to feel empowered. We want to challenge ourselves. We want to reach, and then so it's kind of the shifting of the roles, and constantly we're on the go too. And to have then that expectation that we got to be on top of everything all the time, giving it 200, right? It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
I know. I always empathize with those memes that are like, I need clear skin and blow dried hair and to meditate 20 minutes a day and to pick my kids up and this and this and this and this and somehow have a thriving social life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what, with the menstrual cycle, it's funny because I was just going through it a few days ago where I couldn't get out of bed. And I thought, why am I feeling this way? And then I checked my period cycle. I'm like, got it.
There we go.
Yeah, exactly. And it's those factors, right? It's, it's the systems level factors. It's our skills, our drive our values, but then it's also the health, the biological health, behavior, all of those factors too. It's an all-encompassing sort of way to look at our resiliency.
And so how do we build it, right? So I think that's like that sort of next piece is the research. What we've kind of circled around is like that the research has not in the past hasn't really talked about resiliency as this movable piece, right? You were kind of either born with it or you weren't. Um, we're trying to acknowledge that there are many layers and to what do we mean by resources? It's not just within yourself. It's not just you being tough. And yet we want to empower people, right? And so I don't want to take all of the power away and say, well, it's just your circumstances. It's nothing to do with you. I do think that there are some actionable items that people can take there. What does that look like? Or what do you feel like are the key components to building resiliency in ourselves?
So this is something that we set out to kind of identify, right? To isolate. And I'll say that this is, a work in progress, and many of the researchers are moving towards this, and that it's not like a magic in a bottle. But my model, the multi-system model of resilience, has essentially identified 3 levels of resources that we all need for our resiliency. And at the core, it's kind of our health and health-related behavior. So the things that we do to keep in good health, right? Sleeping, regularly on schedule, or healthy diet, or, those kind of emotion regulation techniques and activities, those things that we keep to maintain our health, those are essential at the core. And then beyond that, it's these skills that we acquire, right? It's, psychological regulation. It's learning about kind of all the different things that we learn throughout our life that helps us be better, right? Time management, for example. All of those little skills and values that help orient us as we navigate life's challenges. And then at the kind of the most external level, we have the structural support. So knowing where your resources are located. Do you know where the emergency or urgent care is nearest to your home? Are you able to manage your finances or feel reasonable that your finances are meeting your needs? Accessing legal services, social services, those kinds of social navigational skills within a larger system are also key to maintaining our resiliency. And these 3 levels kind of meet our different needs, right? They meet our needs relating to feeling safe and secure. They meet our needs relating to wanting to grow as a person or self-growth, and they meet our situational needs as they fluctuate. So if random things come up unexpectedly, are we able to pull on some of our resources to meet those needs? And that's kind of the gist of the model that we developed. Now, identifying exact elements within those models, that's probably going to be a lifetime of work.
And I think that it's important that you pointed that out. And so I would love for us to just reflect on that statement you make about resiliency not being a final destination. I see those two as kind of coming together because the work that it takes, one, is I don't think, none of us are experts at any of those pieces right off the bat. And it's not like you can be like, yes, my time management is a thing. I'm going to put that down and I am good and I don't have to look at that again.
Yeah.
And our health needs change, right? And so even just balancing that component is an evolving piece. But what do you mean when you say resiliency isn't a final destination? Like, what are you trying to harness with that phrase?
That phrase is specifically this idea that, right, that we're not kind of born resilient or not. And it's this, and I hope that with that phrase, it generates enough curiosity and awareness for us to take the first steps to better get to know our resiliency. And I think that's an important piece, is that if we know that, we don't have to turn inwards on ourselves and kind of self-blame or feel lesser than, and we know that it's a work in progress, then we can take the first steps to better evaluate where we're at right now, right? What areas might we need to work on? And then start to build that resiliency as we kind of evolve as people. And that's truly what I hope to accomplish.
You'd mentioned before, right before we hit record, you kind of mentioned the discussion that happened during the pandemic around resiliency, and
Mm,
I had written down like, resiliency as a status symbol is something that I thought what you were saying was quite interesting. And I think that idea of like either you have it or you don't, or
mhm.
I think that that can leave people feeling like it's this uh this final destination that they maybe don't even like have the ability to get to.
Yeah.
But the pandemic put a lot of pressure on people, like, period. But what
Oh
did
my
you
goodness.
notice around the resiliency conversation on either online or in your work through the pandemic?
Yeah, wow. Where do I even begin? So first thing is like resiliency or resilient is such a dirty word ever since the pandemic hit, right? At the beginning, it was kind of it was to this like inspirational word that you want to aspire to get to, right? Because you're work from home, you have some flexibility. Maybe you should, learn baking and start a sourdough kit or something, right? And it's like something that everyone was kind of moving towards. And then by like a few months into the pandemic, people see the word resiliency and they see associated with certain groups or associated with certain outcomes, and they're just starting to get sick of it. And like 1 year in, everyone sees the word, they're probably just wanting to run. And that was very much my experience witnessing too. It became this individual level, make or break label on basically how you handle the pandemic. And it's such a dirty use of it because that's not what it was intended to, I'm sure. And that's not what the research says. But it became this individual destination, right? Or designation, actually, that you're either resilient during the pandemic and you made it out okay, or you're not. And, that's it, you're stuck. Um, and it coincided with a lot of the push for individual resiliency, especially in some of the populations I was working with. So we know the pandemic hit frontline healthcare workers significantly. We saw the burnout, right? Incredible rates of burnout. We saw like 1 in 4 healthcare workers probably met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. We saw people leaving the entire discipline or entire area of profession and never wanting to come back. And that's unfortunately the outcome of a pandemic for a healthcare system that we weren't ready for. And part of the support for a lot of these healthcare workers had been individual resiliency building. And I say that with quotes because, again, the onus became on the person, right? It's like, we know you're burned out. We know you worked two back-to-back shifts in not enough PPEs. We know that you're probably exhausted. You have no time. You didn't even have enough time to change your clothes. But now go home and log onto this app and do some mindfulness because it'll help you, right? And because we want you to be resilient, build resiliency, right? And Jordan, you're laughing as I'm telling this story because you're like, I've heard this probably, right?
Mhm.
But that was the association. It was like, stop telling me what I need to do on my 5 seconds, that I'm home, right? And stop telling me because I've been living in my car for the last 3 months, or in a hotel room, unable to see my family. I'm scared, I'm scared of contracting COVID. I'm scared of giving it to my loved ones. I'm scared of how this thing's going to turn out. I'm exhausted. And yet, if I do this 5 minutes of mindfulness, I'm going to be okay. And so the dirty use of resiliency, along with kind of the focus on the individual level, I think collectively created this dialogue that shifted so much of the onus on the individual person while neglecting everything else, right? System factors, neglecting our individual ability to make decisions within a system. And all of that contributed to resiliency. And so, right, kind of circling back, and I think I totally went on a tangent there, but this idea of resiliency during the pandemic was so focused on the individual, yes or no, resilient or not, that it largely ignored all of the other factors that also contributed to resiliency.
I witnessed that. And I think, some of my struggles of working with people on the individual level was that
Mhm.
exactly, right? And I work with some healthcare workers, but lots of people in roles where the leadership was under so much pressure during the
Yes.
pandemic. And there's nothing like a good pandemic to expose the weaknesses in your leadership team.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Whew.
And I think and I've said this to patients too, that when the pandemic hit and everyone, everyone turned their head towards the leadership in their workspace. And
Yeah.
that person may have been, not equipped to be in that position. They may have been promoted into that position without the skills. They maybe didn't even, the work environment maybe didn't even know what skills a leader needed in that position because
Mhm.
they hadn't faced any bad times or any times that required tremendous leadership. And yet everybody, like when the pandemic, everyone went like this and like looked towards the leadership in their organization, and it wasn't there, or they
Yes.
were hopeful, like, you know what, we'll just keep doing what we've always done and hopefully this will go away, right? Like I
Yes.
said, many organizations used we'll pretend this isn't really happening as long as possible.
Yeah.
But then me as their practitioner, I ended up in that same issue where I was like, okay, like, why don't you do online grocery ordering so you don't have to cook? Like I was stuck with making it about the individual, right? Like
Mhm.
talking about how to support their sleep or their take, the melatonin, or do your mindfulness or order groceries so that we save some time over here. That's where I was trapped, where the challenge was at a systems level. The challenge was they don't have enough humans to do the work at their
Mhm.
work. And yet the responsibility fell down to this person to like keep a healthcare appointment, pay out
Mhm.
of pocket for like private healthcare. And then my solutions were still at an individual level because I couldn't impact it at a systems level.
Mhm. And that's the challenge too, is that, we're all individuals. Even the leaders themselves are
Mm,
individuals trapped, right? And I think not enough of the dialogue also should highlight that your leaders have leaders, and their leaders have leaders, and their leaders have leaders. Even entire sectors are embedded within systems that they have to answer to. And so a large part of the challenge is sometimes that communication piece too. We, right, we look this way and we, complain, or we highlight issues to our leaders, expecting there to be some type of feedback loop or some type of communication. But sometimes it stops there. And even if the leaders take it up to their leaders, or right, however high it goes, we don't hear it back. And sometimes feeling that disconnectedness is enough to leave us kind of disenfranchised in our roles, and left us feeling like we're not resilient, quote unquote, right? And so I think part of the challenge there is we know the system is broken, but we also work within that system. And how can we better communicate that, right? Even in the absence of any actions, at least to know that someone is trying, I think can sometimes help. And also at the individual level, there are things we can do, right? So all the things you pointed out, like ordering groceries online, maybe someone didn't think of that, and that saves 30 to an hour each day, or every other day or so, right? I think those small things are not to be discounted, but they must also work within a system, at least a system that tries to communicate.
You're right. I just was reflecting on, when we think about like the opposite of resiliency is burnout, and when we think about some of those
Mhm.
burnout scales, it's mostly around workplace
Yes.
systems, leadership, communication. Do you feel productive and impactful in the work that you're doing?
Mhm.
It is a systems discussion when we talk burnout, and yet the solutions, I'm like totally on board with what you're saying there. The solution is like, you need to go to bed 15 minutes earlier.
Yeah, yeah, and try this app, right? Try
Yeah,
this,
that's
try.
right.
But again, this was the challenge too, right? We, Public Health Agency of Canada put out a series of fundings about supporting frontline healthcare workers in the reduction of burnout and PTSD, and so many of the projects were focusing on individual level solutions. And a year into this, we're finding that those individual level solutions aren't having the benefits that we had hoped. Not because they didn't introduce important life skills, not because they didn't introduce little tips and tricks and stuff to better support our well-being, but because those are not the reasons why we're burning out, right? We're burning out because we feel uncared for and disconnected from the system that we're a part of. And so how do we tackle that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear, and I know you are working or you have an app, and I know that there's more in development. So I do want you to share about what that resource is and how our listeners could maybe use that to have this self-reflection piece around resiliency. But I would love to hear your comments around where you feel like the research is going with respect to resiliency. When you were talking about resiliency being a dirty word there, I feel that in a slightly different way. I feel like that conversation around resiliency is starting to sound like the self-care conversation that we see so often online, right? And you'll see the social media influencer who's like, and I drink lemon water and it helps my resiliency. And I'm like, you can't just put the word resiliency in anywhere. It loses so much meaning, but then it also undermines the real work, right? Like the real resiliency building techniques. It sounds like such a catchphrase when it's spoken about in that way. But where is the research going in resiliency building, and what's your involvement in that? And then I'd love to hear about your app too.
Absolutely. I think, we've been kind of talking about resiliency and talking about all of the shortcomings of individual interventions. And so I hope that listeners aren't discouraged, because I think in the presence of these kind of monumental challenges, it really does push a discipline forward in a revolutionary way. So with that, I think it's nice to share this optimistic outlook that the area of resiliency research is going towards the right way. We recognized during the pandemic and thereafter that individual level solutions aren't enough. Not to say that they're not part of the resiliency dialogues, but they're not enough. And so the literature moving forward is much more focused on evolving our understanding of resiliency beyond the individual characteristics and traits and skills to better address the systems level. So things like, how can we focus on organizational communications to align goals and values and to make us feel like we're part of the organization? That's an important part of resiliency. How do we equip individuals at different levels with different skills, recognizing that they need different ones, not universal meditation and deep breathing, right? But about communicating conflict solution to leaders, to individual level discussions about how to bring up challenging solutions or challenging situations to your boss at work, supporting different needs using different resources and skills building. I think those are kind of the movement for the resiliency literature. And I think that ties into my tool, right? We know resiliency is multifaceted. There's multiple systems to our resiliency. And a better understanding of that enables us to then focus on what we need. And so based on that assumption, we created a tool that assesses our resiliency, not as an outcome, but just so that we're aware of what our level of resources stand and how it meets our needs. And so we build a self-assessment tool. It's a free app. It takes 30 seconds and you're welcome to delete it after you use it. But it's 27 questions, right? Self-report questions you go through, and then it'll generate a report, a very brief report that just highlights where your different resilience resources fall and how well they meet your different levels of needs. And that's to paint a brief picture about your resiliency capacity as it evolves. And perhaps that will prompt you to think about some of the areas that maybe you haven't thought about in your life. Maybe work on some different aspects or reach out or gain support, right? But it's this understanding that perhaps knowledge is the first piece of that foundation.
I love that. And I feel like that kind of tool can help people. I just use that term of like when we're like holding some of our mental health experiences out in front of us, like at arm's length, to look at it in a slightly different lens, right? It's so easy to feel like something is us, right? Like that's this experience that we're having of being overwhelmed or unable to meet the demands is us, when it's really, there's more to it than that. It's more complex, right? And if we can teach patients to hold, whether it's their anxiety or their burnout or their resiliency out at arm's length, you start to be able to see it from those perspectives of like, you know what, like my kid woke me up like 4 times in the night. Of course I cried at work,
Yes.
or whatever it is. And rather than feeling like it is us, because I think that's where some of that, it propels some of the shame and some of the blame around your circumstances, when it feels like these traits or these characteristics about ourselves, this lack that we have in ourselves. Whereas when you understand the complexity of how resiliency is built, you can hold it out at arm's length and be like, at which factors are influencing the way that I currently feel about this situation?
Yeah.
It is a much more, almost like you're in third person perspective of what all the systems that are at play that impact the way that you feel day to day. And I think that is a much more empowered way of thinking about your life and your resiliency, because you can see the things that, like, air quotes, aren't your fault, uh,
Mhm.
and contextualize that, and then maybe find those in, like, those purchase points where you can get in there
Yeah.
and actually make a difference.
Absolutely. And we do this to our friends, right? We do this to our
Totally.
families. We
Yes.
do this for everyone. And yet we can't, it's tough for us to hold our experiences at arm's length and consider ourselves as the holder of that experience, as opposed to this is us. We're so easy to just be like, this is us. I am moody today. I'm no good today. Right. But we don't do that to our friends. We don't do that to our family. Right. So no, it's
That's
it's
such a good
nice to be
point.
able to, right, hold ourselves at an arm's length and really look at,
I
yeah.
love that. And what's next for you, like in your work and your career? And we'll put links to the app right in the show notes. And so if you're recognizing that, that you don't see your resiliency as separate from you, and that we're that self-assessment tool, which I think probably everyone who's listening at this point should do it. But what's next for you, Jenny? Like, where are you going to take this?
Well, it's a lifetime commitment, right? To better understand our resiliency. But for the time being, spending a lot of time better developing resiliency at the organizational level, because that's where the lack is, and that's where the need is most urgent. So we're working at our research center on several projects to better identify, what are, as you said, the purchase points for the organizational level development of resiliency. Is it communication strategies? Is it realignment of values? Is it better kind of managing individual expectations at different levels? And focusing on that to better support those most affected by the pandemic. So that's kind of one line of research. Also using the model to better understand what are the challenges that any group is facing, right? What are the kind of the needs, the most urgent needs, so we can better develop tools to support them. One of the population is veterans, new veterans transitioning out of their military service, right? We know their needs are great, but what are those top priorities if needs not being met? And finally, we're working on a new version of the app that is a little bit more hands-on and skills training based. So based on the model of resiliency we have and the assessment tool, based on your score, you'll be recommended specific training skills building activities or tools or toolkits. And that's designed to kind of holistically build your resilience across all of the systems. So that's something we're working on and we'll pilot at a Toronto hospital in the very near future.
Amazing. And I think this conversation has been really important for me because one, you sort of validated that even though sometimes I feel like those small steps that we take with people, order your groceries, go to bed earlier, like, or a drop in the bucket versus some of those systems challenges, that they're still important, right? So
Mhm.
I feel validated. So thank you.
They are the foundation of our resiliency, right? Because they lie at the most inner core. When everything else is falling apart, those are the things that we can hang on to.
Right. And the things that each individual who is a self-motivated, high-performing person who's listening to a podcast on resiliency building, right? There are things that you can latch on to that can change your state. And I think that's important. I really like the acknowledgement of the skills, the time management, the communication. Like that's an area that I probably myself have like not considered as part of that resiliency building strategy. But I really like that this conversation around systems because I think it removes some of the blame from each individual, recognizing that they are part of a framework. And
Mhm.
even something as simple as you mentioned, like knowing where the emergency department is. We live in a high resource area, you and I, and most people probably know where the emergency department is, but there are examples of that in everyone's life, right? Where the very like basic needs that they have are not at at their fingertips, and that's influencing how you can show up at work, right? Even though it's like would not be of conscious mind to even be able to articulate it.
Mhm.
Um, Even like being in a food island, right, where maybe where you live fresh produce isn't something that's readily available,
Yeah.
is going to be that same kind of example that's influencing your ability to show up. So I appreciate like sort of all of those angles that we've looked at resiliency through, and I think it makes it uh a more hopeful conversation actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. I hope it's shifted away from kind of the dirty word to something that we can look forward to.
Yeah, I agree. Where can our listeners find you? What's the best place for them to get connected? I know we'll put
Mhm.
the links for the app in the show notes, but I'd also love for them to be follow along with the work that you're doing and hear more of what you have to say.
Absolutely. And this is part of where I probably fall a little bit flat on is kind of the updates, but I'm going to list my website, which I'll work harder to maintain and can keep updated where all of the kind of the research is showcased. I'm also active on Twitter. We're relatively speaking active on Twitter. So, follow me on social media that way. And I would love to be connected to anyone who's interested in this research.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for spending this time with me today. Your work is super important, and I'm excited to see professional women taking big steps in medicine in the gaps that we know that are there. I think this is such a profound area of work that you are spending that you've dedicated your life towards. And so I'm so grateful that we had a chance to talk.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.